Real estate agency disclosure and election. The pre-printed portion of this form has been drafted by the Arizona Association of Realtors. Any change in the pre-printed language of this form must be made in a prominent manner. No representations are made as to the legal validity, adequacy, and/or effects of any provision, including tax consequences thereof. If you desire legal, tax, or other professional advice, please consult your attorney, tax advisor, or professional consultant. Disclosure. Before a seller or landlord, hereinafter referred to as seller, or a buyer or tenant, hereinafter referred to as buyer, enters into a discussion with a real estate broker or licensee affiliated with a broker, the seller and the buyer should understand what type of agency, relationship, or representation they will have with the broker in the transaction. Buyer's broker. A broker other than the seller's broker can agree with the buyer to act as the broker for the buyer. In these situations, the buyer's broker is not representing the seller, even if the buyer's broker is receiving compensation for services rendered, either in full or in part, from the seller or through the seller's broker. A buyer's broker has the fiduciary duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, and accounting in dealing with the buyer. Other potential buyers represented by broker may consider, make offers on, or acquire an interest in the same or similar properties as buyer is seeking. Seller's broker. A broker under a listing agreement with the seller acts as the broker for the seller only. A seller's broker has the fiduciary duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, and accounting in dealing with the seller. Other potential sellers represented by broker may list properties that are similar to the property that seller is selling. Broker representing both seller and buyer, limited representation. A broker either acting directly or through one or more licensees within the same brokerage firm can legally represent both the seller and the buyer in a transaction, but only with the knowledge and informed consent of both the seller and the buyer. In these situations, the broker, acting through its licensee, represents both the buyer and the seller, with limitations of the duties owed to the buyer and the seller. The broker will not, without written authorization, disclose to the other party that the seller will accept a price or terms other than stated in the listing, or that the buyer will accept a price or terms other than offered. There will be conflicts in the duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, and confidentiality. Disclosure of confidential information may be made only with written authorization. Regardless of who the broker represents in the transaction, The broker shall exercise reasonable skill and care in the performance of the broker's duties, and shall be truthful and honest to both the buyer and the seller, and shall disclose all known facts which materially and adversely affect the consideration to be paid by any party pursuant to ARS 32-2156. Sellers, leasers, and brokers are not obligated to disclose that a property is or has been the site of a natural death, suicide, homicide, or any crime classified as a felony, owned or occupied by a person exposed to HIV or diagnosed as having AIDS or any other disease not known to be transmitted through common occupancy of real estate, or located in the vicinity of a sex offender. Sellers or sellers' representatives may not treat the evidence or the existence, terms, or conditions of offers as confidential unless there is a confidentiality agreement between the parties. The duties of the broker in a real estate transaction do not relieve the seller or the buyer from the responsibility to protect their own interests. The seller and the buyer should carefully read all agreements to ensure that the documents adequately express their understanding of the transaction. These buyer or tenant election. Complete this section only if you are the buyer. The undersigned elects to have the broker check any that apply. Represent the buyer as buyer's broker. Check the box. Represent the seller as seller's broker. Check the box. Show buyer properties listed with broker's firm and buyer agrees that broker shall act as agent for both buyer and seller, provided that the seller consents to limited representation. In the event of a purchase, buyers and sellers' informed consent should be acknowledged in a separate writing other than the purchase contract. Sellers or landlord election. Complete this section only if you are the seller. The undersigned elects to have the broker check any that apply. Represent the buyer as buyer's broker. Check the box. Represent the seller as seller's broker. Check the box. Show seller's property to buyers represented by broker's firm, and seller agrees that broker shall act as agent for both seller and buyer, provided that buyer consents to the limited representation. In the event of purchase, buyers and sellers' informed consent should be acknowledged in a separate writing other than the purchase contract. So you would check any of these boxes that apply. The undersigned, check the box. Buyers, or check the box, sellers, acknowledge that this document is a disclosure of duties. This document is not an employment agreement. This document is not an employment agreement. And check whatever box it applies. Print name, sign month, day, and year, sign month, day, and year.